Week in the Boardroom. Brought to you by Corporate Board Member Magazine and the NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure this week to welcome our guest, Turney Stevens, who's the Dean of the College of Business at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, and also is involved with the Dean Institute for Corporate Governance and Integrity, also at Lipscomb. So, Turney, welcome to the show.
Thanks, TK. It's a pleasure to be here.
First, for our audience, not that many people probably know about the Dean Institute, and give us a little history on that and what its quest is, and I think our audience will be interested. Certainly they'll be hearing more about the Dean Institute in the future.
Sure, I'll be happy to do that, and it might help to begin with a little bit of context regarding Lipscomb University even. Lipscomb is a faith-based institution in Nashville, Tennessee, as you said. It was founded in 1891, affiliated with the Churches of Christ. Today the university has 3,700 students, about 1,000 graduate students, about 2,700 undergraduate students, and perhaps unique in the whole country, we also have a campus school which goes from kindergarten through grade 12. So we're one of the few institutions of higher education that begins at kindergarten and goes through doctoral degrees, which is very unique. As a faith-based institution, we think it's our mission not only to educate our students to a high level of academic achievement, but also to instill a sense of morality, of ethics, of integrity in our students, to challenge them to be ready for the challenges that they'll face in life when they leave the institution. And so it was a natural outgrowth when I came to the College of Business as Dean to look for ways that we could not only assist our students but serve the general public in these areas that affect not only best practices but also issues of integrity, and that's where the Dean Institute came from.
Well, you certainly, most of the time when we think about deans, we think of somebody that's been in academia for some time, but in your case, longtime business person, serve on a board of directors, so you bring a little different perspective to the role of the dean.
Well, I do, and I appreciate that. Yes, I was an investment banker for 35 years before I retired and began to teach at Lipscomb. And from that experience, the president of the university asked me if I would consider serving as the dean. Now, the Dean Institute is not named after my role as dean. It's named after the benefactors, Hilton and Sally Dean. Hilton, of course, is a public accountant, but he also rose to be the vice chairman of Ernst & Young worldwide. Served as the chief financial officer of Ernst & Young. Sally is a certified public accountant, a public practitioner herself, and taught at NYU here in New York, as a matter of fact, when they lived here. And so it was from their commitment to this concept of excellence and integrity that the idea for the Dean Institute was born, and they became our benefactors, and that's why the Institute is named the Hilton and Sally Dean Institute.
Well, you know, this area of integrity and ethics is sort of challenging to get your arms around. I think that's one of the things that makes the Institute sort of unique to sort of approach this, and I'll be anxious to hear in the future how that's done. But let's actually talk about that a second, Turney, because, you know, here is something that is not readily measurable. Obviously, we see it when the effects of when it's not in place there, but what would you say to somebody if they wanted to take their company's temperature on, you know, sort of ethics and integrity? How does one go about doing that in today's world?
Well, I think the first thing you do is you study the academic body of knowledge that's been created on that subject, and one of the things that we hope to contribute to through the work of the Dean Institute is to advance that body of knowledge to be a thought leader in that area. We've been very impressed, for example, with the work of certain academic leaders like Ben Heinemann at Harvard, who has worked very hard to create metrics by which the performance of business unit leaders in the area of integrity is measured just like profitability is measured. And he's done some amazing work in that area, first for General Electric and now as an academic at Harvard. There are others who are thinking about this whole area of the squishiness of measuring integrity. I guess I would summarize that, though, by saying that at the end of the day, it really all starts at the top. And regardless of how you may measure the culture of the organization or how you reduce it to a set of metrics, you know it when you see it. And without a commitment from the very top, not only from the CEO and the CFO, but also from the board, to have an organization and to create a culture of high integrity, then that organization is not going to be committed to integrity, and there are going to be unfortunate exceptions to the policy of compliance that will be evident perhaps throughout the organization.
Yeah, when you're discussing those things, you're also talking about culture. You know, the creation of a ethical culture. There's some very good writings on competing with an ethical culture that, to me, sounds like a great goal for everybody to sort of achieve. But here we are. We've just come off of the financial crisis. Okay, the public's view of directors is not very high at this point. Okay, we've seen incidences like BP, we've seen HP, we've seen B of A lot of cases where the initial reaction is that the board has been asleep at the switch, and subsequently it seems like all directors have been painted with that broad brush. But is that your view, or do you think that these are isolated incidences, but the media, there's no question that that's what makes interesting headlines?
Well, you know, the old saying is, if it bleeds, it leads. And so you can't really blame the news media for seeking to sell newspapers or to snare viewers. But with that having been said, it does seem that particularly in the last few years, we've had almost an epidemic of fraud and corruption in this country. And it is troubling. There's no question about that. I think it has vast ramifications that find their way down to the minds of our students. One of the things that troubles me the most is the attitude that our millennial generation undergraduate students have toward careers in business. They've grown up in an era where all they've seen are frauds and corruption stories about business, and they forget about all the good things that business does. And they also don't have the perspective that perhaps you and I have, where we realize that the number of people that are exceptions to the rule are really fairly few. Most people do the right thing most of the time. And of course, without that, we couldn't function as a culture. But our young people today don't have that perspective. And as a result of that, I think we're losing some of the best and brightest who could otherwise be great business people, but choose to go other directions in their lives because they think they can't be in business and still do good with their lives.
Yeah. When I think of integrity and culture, I think of the importance of the board when it comes across those 4 or 5 watershed events that all companies have that sort of establish that culture. And give you an example where you let's say have a multi-national company and you're operating in a place where they might take bribes or operate less than what would be a good standard for the U.S. And somebody falls, a good person falls victim to that, and obviously the board's held responsible. Well, whenever you have a good employee that has crossed the line, it creates a difficult situation. But that's what I call a watershed event, because how the board and management deals with that issue will send a message across the whole organization that this is what our culture is.
Absolutely.
So to me, companies have, and boards particularly, have to watch for watershed events to make sure that they're building that culture. Is that pretty much?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And my wife and I have two sons, one 26 and one 22. And as we raised our children, we struggled with the idea of how do you instill this sense of moral integrity in your children. And I think the answer lies in example. If they don't see the example in their parents, then they're not going to have high levels of integrity. And the same thing's true with employees, with coworkers, with the culture of the organization. Again, I think it has to start from the top, and there has to be an example set, and there has to be a clear message sent to all members of the culture that this is the way we're going to operate this business, and we expect you to comply with this and to be a part of this. Now, the challenge becomes in how do you get people to do that without being watched all the time, without being big brothered. And that's where the work of a Ben Heineman, I think, is so fascinating, because he's tried to deal with this idea of how do you get people to do the right thing inherently from the bottom up as opposed to strictly from the top down.
Well, he has been a guest, one of the early guests on this show, for the very reasons that you spoke about. He really is very wise in his thought leadership in this space, and he has so much experience, so much corporate experience with that it really is very valuable. I'd like you to share a story before we went on air. You and I were talking a little bit about the challenge. I know the Dean Institute gets a chance to work with public companies in the Nashville area, and there was somebody whose name we'll keep confidential, but that was talking about the challenge at their organization of operating globally around the area of creating an ethical culture in countries that differ so greatly from the U.S. Share that story, if you will.
Well, the story I think I told you was a conversation that I had just last week with a woman in Nashville who has just become the worldwide director of ethics for a major global corporation. The company is not based in Nashville, but she lives in Nashville and works from Nashville. And as this brand new director of global ethics, she's struggling with this very concept. How do you reconcile cultures all over the world in which this company does business and cultures that are, in many cases, significantly different in terms of their definition of what's right and what's wrong? How do you manage those cultures? How do you guide those employees? How do you create policies that apply across the board? It's easy enough to say, well, this is U.S. law, this is what you have to do since we're a U.S. corporation. But there's so many other things that aren't covered by law, and so that becomes part of the fabric of the corporation. That's part of the culture, and certainly part of her challenge as to how do you communicate that and establish those standards of behavior throughout the organization.
Well, to me, it hit a note that hadn't been hit before about the challenge of that, and it is true that those countries, they have no special reason to recognize, necessarily the way that this country has chose to impose its guidelines on those companies and
Sure.
create a culture within that. So that is an interesting perspective. Let me ask you a closing question with this, and that is, you've again had the perspective of looking at this from many different angles, the corporate governance and the integrity issue. When you look at American business and all that's happened, in the past 10 years, which certainly has been a lot, what sort of worries you, about trends looking forward, and what sort of gives you hope, looking forward?
Great question. I'm an optimist by nature, and I think we live in a fabulous country, and I think we have a terrific population of people in the American business community. But with that having been said, I don't think I would be alone to say that there are things that trouble all of us about American business culture today. Just yesterday, I think Wharton announced that their MBA curriculum has been revised to place more emphasis on business ethics and more emphasis on risk assessment and risk management. A few months ago, Harvard introduced the MBA oath in an attempt to try to balance this post-World War II emphasis on quantitative analysis with more emphasis on the ethical side of business culture. And I do think we have had, speaking as an MBA product myself, I think we have had perhaps an overemphasis on quantitative analysis and on the dictum that the first obligation of management is to maximize shareholder value, taking nothing away from the importance of profitability. It's also true that it is an obligation of the corporation to do the right thing, and to do the right thing inside the culture of the countries in which it operates. And so I think that troubles me, that we're trying to find this balance, and I don't know that we've found that yet. I think we're struggling to try to find that balance in America today. Well,
I think the Dean Institute's quest for integrity in the boardroom is a very commendable quest. We'll look forward to some of the programs I know that you're going to be putting out in that space, and hopefully the end result of that will be that you'll be less worried about that going forward. And don't forget, it's your role to start that with the students, so make sure that curriculum and that stuff is well done. Turney, thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. And that will conclude this week's edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We invite you to join us again next week, where we'll take a look at issues and trends that will help you be a better director and a better committee member. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member Magazine and host the NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss.